Welcome back to Living the Grace Life. I'm your host, Jennifer Sakata, and you've made your way to the corner of real grace for your real life. Today's episode is a re-release of episode 27, Unexpected Grace and the Impact of Executive Order 9066. Japanese American Remembrance Day is February 19th, and today's updated episode is in honor of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated through Executive Order 9066. Regardless of your ethnic background or how you first made your way to American shores, this is a story that's critically important, not only for Americans, but for people all around the world who are embroiled in battles over who stays or who goes, over who we perceive to be important and who's not, because grace always takes a different path. Today's episode is a reminder that sometimes grace is hard to come by. It's difficult to live into grace when people would rather unsee you than acknowledge the wrong that was done to cause your pain. In this case, it was the forced removal of over 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry from their homes and moved into incarceration camps out in the deserts of the West. It's an ugly cut in the history of the United States, a part of history that, being honest, I had never heard about until I became an adult. But if history is to be our teacher, that we not repeat the sins of our past, then conversations like these are critical for moving forward. All around the world, we continue to unsee people we don't understand or we don't like or we disagree with, accusing and discarding people who appear to be the enemy or threaten our sense of safety. Friend, grace always takes a different path, where God determines worth and defines our identity, where the creator of the universe redeems what's broken and allows us to begin again. Before jumping into today's episode, I want to recommend a 6-episode podcast that aired in January of 2026. It's called Burn Order by Rachel Maddow, and it chronicles the early development of Executive Order 9066 as it began to take shape in our culture long before it was signed into law on February 19th, 1942. Rachel and her staff have done a phenomenal job of researching and presenting the facts. Her podcast includes interviews of people who were directly involved on both sides of the incarceration, as well as interviews from people who many years later helped piece together the research to help us understand the bigger picture of the story as it actually happened. I'll link her podcast, Burn Order, in the show notes, so be sure and check that out. Thank you in advance for being part of this conversation that I believe is especially relevant right now, in a day when many of the things that were forced upon Japanese Americans are happening again to American citizens of other descents. And whether you agree or disagree with what I share today, conversations like these are critically important because they equip us not to repeat one of the ugliest cuts across the fabric of American history. As always, even if we don't agree, I welcome your correspondence and conversation. You can email me at jennifer@jennifersakata.com, or you can find me on my website at jennifersakata.com, or on all my socials, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Jennifer Sakata. Now, welcome to episode 73, Japanese American Incarceration and Unexpected Grace. Today's real life takes us to the immense humility it takes to respond not with revenge or anger, but with forgiveness, welcome, and the courage to move forward. December 7th, 1941 is an infamous day the United States remembers with deep sorrow. and rightly so. Maybe you've watched one of the movies or read your kid the I Survived series. Maybe you listened to stories of your parents and grandparents who served during World War II, the ones who were there when red circled wings came out of nowhere. It was the day Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese. Over 2,000 people died that day, taking with them hopes and dreams that should have been theirs to live out. This part I'd known. I grew up seeing images of the mangled USS Arizona and its warriors buried alive under the water. I'd heard stories of Hangar 37 and its iconic bullet sprays throughout the glass. Nothing in that attack was honorable. 20 years ago, when I started dating my husband, I discovered a different kind of tragedy was conceived as a result of that day. 3 months later, on February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. This order required the forcible relocation and imprisonment of nearly 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living in so-called military zones established in Washington, Oregon, and California during World War II. Regardless of their American citizenship status or length of residence, thousands were forced to give up their homes, their family possessions, their businesses, their farms, their friends, and their neighborhoods. Nearly 2/3 of those who were relocated were documented American citizens. Men, women, college students, children, business owners, professors, anyone of Japanese descent living on the Pacific coast were given 1 week to pack what they could carry or fit into one bag. Initially, they were transported to what were called assembly centers. In some cases, these assembly centers were literally horse stalls that had been emptied mere hours before. They remained in these assembly centers for several months before they were then relocated to crude and cramped quarters scattered throughout the desert regions of the United States, including California, Arizona, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Arkansas. Most notable among the internment camps was Manzanar and Lake Tule in California. Mr. Ted Nagata, a close family friend of my husband's family, was incarcerated with his family and over 8,000 others at Topaz. In our conversation several years ago, Mr. Nagata described his family's removal in this way. Listen to what he said. Since we could only take what we could carry, in effect, that means we lost everything. Many people lost their homes, their cars, their businesses, their furniture, their bank accounts. I remember some who even sold merchandise worth $100 for $5. The government offered to store people's possessions, but with a catch. The government would not be held responsible for any lost or stolen items. When the war was over, our family was told not to go back for our possessions because there was nothing there. I think that's how it was for most people who stored their things that way. That's a story about the internment that is not widely known. It was bad enough to lose 3.5 years of your life, but to lose all of your family possessions, your property, your business, and then have to start over from scratch, that part was just as hard. It's one thing to read these words in a book or someone else's pages, but to have actually sat at a table with the person who actually experienced these things was eye-opening for me in ways I had no idea I'd been blinded to. In 1942, Dorothea Lange, you may know her iconic artwork from the candid images she took of the 1930s Great Depression. Well, in 1942, she was hired by the U.S. government to document what they called at that time the evacuation and relocation of Japanese Americans. As one publication put it, while Dorothea was opposed to the idea, she was eager to take the commission because she thought a true record of the evacuation would be valuable in the future. How true her words were then. As military commanders went through her images, they saw what she saw, that this was no evacuation. This was imprisonment. So they seized her images, they censored them, and then deposited them into the National Archives, unavailable for viewing until 2006. When those images were finally released, she put a book together called Impounded: Dorothea Lange and the Censored Images of Japanese American Internment. And in this book, she showed the different phases of imprisonment and the devastating impact Executive Order 9066 would have on generations to come. Dorothea documented one mother who said this to her son. "Listen, my son," Ellen Kiskiyama wrote, "now that you are older, Mother wants you to understand why your only friends are the sanseis," that's third generation Japanese Americans, "and why your only home is the barrack, why you eat meals in the mess halls, and why you don't ride the streetcars, buses, and automobiles. Pearl Harbor," she explained, "changed all our plans. And little by little, our home was broken up, and all the fancy dreams we had planned for you had to be altered." The conditions people lived in, family members of my husband's family, were harsh, with little protection from the elements in winter and the incredible heat in the summer. Multiple families were forced to live in cramped quarters with little more than a bedsheet to divide each family. Mr. Nagata and several others who shared their stories with me described how desperately cold it was without any protection or adequate clothing. How they'd been separated from family members, their schools, their friends, their scholarships, and their future for reasons that wouldn't ever make sense, even when they were old enough. Incarcerated Japanese Americans did what they could to make the camps feel as much like home as possible, establishing newspapers, sports teams, schools, markets, worship centers, and all of those normalizing things in all of our lives. But the guard towers, barbed wire, barracks of wood, and tar paper housing was an assault on humanity and an ugly cut in U.S. history, still wielding its influence today. Although the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066 was upheld twice during the war, decades later, President Gerald Ford signed an order on February 19, 1976, disallowing any future president from reinstituting the devastating order. With the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, President Ronald Reagan issued a public apology on behalf of the government and authorized reparations for former Japanese internees and their descendants. And although that was a long-awaited step in the right direction, I was astounded to discover that 85,000 of the nearly 120,000 incarcerated were granted payment of $20,000 for each survivor, despite having lost hundreds of thousands before, during, and after their 3.5 years of imprisonment. This was a mere drop in the bucket for American citizens who were targeted, rounded up, and imprisoned simply for having the face of the enemy. These are the facts on paper. And although that was many years ago now, if we are honest with ourselves, we are still in the midst of tremendous upheaval as a result of this executive orders and others like it. No Japanese Americans were ever charged, much less convicted, of espionage or sabotage against the United States. Not one Japanese American. Now, behind these facts stand the lives of people whose families, livelihoods, and futures were completely and sometimes irreparably upended. Imagine losing everything you've worked generations for and being forced to begin again on nothing while knowing that your possessions were probably in someone else's home. and that your future was in the hands of people who would rather unsee you than make things right. I know as I think about all of you who are listening today, there are some of you who know this reality all too well, and I am so, so sorry. And today is my offering to move us a little bit more in the right direction. Every February 19th, the Japanese American community commemorates Executive Order 9066 as a reminder of the impact the incarceration experience had on our families, our community, and our country, as the Japanese American Civil Liberties League wrote. It is an opportunity to educate others on the fragility of civil liberties in times of crisis and the importance of remaining vigilant in protecting the rights and freedoms of everyone. 2 years ago, I was on a trip to DC with our older son as he had finished 8th grade. And we had an amazing tour guide. John, he knew his way in and out of the more than 80 historical sites we visited. We arrived at a park dedicated to Roosevelt's memory. And I took pictures of our son as he, sidled himself in between the bronze statues of the poor lined up for the resources as a result of FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression. And as our guide continued his description of the many initiatives FDR instituted, I asked him quietly as we walked if he had ever heard of Executive Order 9066 and the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Or that his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who still wanted to honor and safeguard her husband's presidency, strongly opposed the executive order, communicating to him her fear of the repercussions that would last for generations. John had not. He wasn't familiar with either of those, and to his credit, John invited me to give a brief history to our tour of more than 80 people about how Executive Order 9066 dramatically altered the lives of family members and friends accused of being dangerous. Like me, many on our tour that day, they'd never heard of Executive Order 9066, nor of the way it's still impacting Japanese Americans today. This February 19 marks 80 years since Executive Order 9066 cut its way into the fabric of U.S. history and our lives. And initially, I was embarrassed that I'd never learned about such an ugly part of our American past, that for so long I lived easily unaware about the stories and people who would one day become my family. And here's where unexpected grace comes in. To this day, I am astonished and humbled by family members and friends who were incarcerated but who refused to become bitter. Real people like Mr. Nagata and Mrs. Misaka, whose families lost everything after working just as hard as their white neighbors, who, despite having every reason to spin out and be angry or seek revenge, chose instead to offer pardon in place of finger pointing. These are people who feared God, people who followed Jesus and spent their entire lives moving forward, educating others and working beyond a wrong that was never truly righted. This is grace. Undeserved, unmerited, unearned, unfair, and unjust grace. Have you ever considered how unjust and unfair God's grace actually is? We don't deserve what Jesus did for us any more than what he equips us to offer towards someone who's wronged us. This is grace. And so today I offer our episode with a desire to educate, as I wasn't, but also to challenge us to extend pardon where it isn't deserved, to move toward when it makes more sense to run away. And I'm not talking about ignoring an abusive situation or moving towards someone who isn't safe. Having safe boundaries is an act of grace too. God's grace compels us to offer forgiveness beyond our ability to give it. It's what Jesus meant when he responded to Peter's question, how often do I have to forgive someone? Jesus' answer, 70 times 7, which I know I come back to a lot. Friends, it wasn't a math equation. It's an exhortation to keep returning to God for him to provide what we can't provide on our own. So today, I offer a prayer for Japanese American Remembrance Day. On behalf of Japanese American mothers and fathers who had to look their children in the face and summon the courage to remind them who they are and who God is. I pray in honor of those women, men, and children who, in the face of extreme cruelty and unkindness, choose even today not to wear their incarceration as a kind of branded excuse for hate or payback. Let them be our model today. To these men, women, and children, I give my humble offering in hopes that Craig's and my Japanese American children, along with your own children and grandchildren, will be able to tell their children they were part of establishing a different kind of world starting today. So I invite you to pray with me this prayer that's loosely adapted from Psalm 139. Heavenly Father, creator of all that is good and right and noble and pure in this world, you created each of us in your image. You have examined us and you know everything about us. You know when we sit down and when we get up. You know our thoughts when we are far from you. You see us when we travel and when we stay home. You know everything we say and do, as well as everything we don't say and don't do. You go before us. You follow us, and you place your hand of blessing on our heads. Thank you for making us so wonderfully complex. Your work in us is marvelous. Help us live today into that marvelousness. Your thoughts about us, they're enough to push back less than thoughts others have thought about us. Clear the way for us to bring out your beauty in those around us. You watch every moment as it unfolds for us. Please give us eyes to see as you see, and lives with which to welcome and love as you welcome and love us in grace and in truth. Through the power and the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Thanks for joining our conversation today, even as we wake to the impact of additional executive orders that are literally changing the landscape of the U.S. and the world even now. As was my desire back then, our job is to educate ourselves, to be aware of what's going on around us. And although we can't single-handedly fix everything around us that does not speak the name Jesus, we can speak to those things, places, and most importantly, people who are right in front of us. This is God's grace. I'll list in the show notes below a series of resources, including picture books for children, some of the interviews from Mr. Nagata, and other books I pray you will find helpful as you consider Executive Order 9066 and Unexpected Grace as we move into Japanese American Day of Remembrance on February 19th. Until we meet again, may God's absurdly generous grace go before you, be in you, and through you. Grace for you, grace for them.